Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you guys are doing well. So this video is just going to be a summary of what we did in chapter 23, where we're looking at measuring GDP and economic growth. So we have 7 objectives which we'll cover, 7 objectives of this video, which we'll try and cover in a very short span of time. So what I want you guys to understand, first of all, is what macroeconomics is and how it differs from microeconomics. So with macroeconomics, we are basically looking at the whole economy, right? We're not looking at how individuals, how firms, how businesses on an individual level operate, but we are looking at how the whole economy operates, right? So macroeconomics has 5 economic objectives. The first one is economic growth. The second one is full employment. The third one is curbing inflation. The fourth one is balance of payments. And the fifth one is equality. So in the first chapter, we look at the first one, which is economic growth. In the next video, I'm going to cover monitoring jobs, which will be looking at the second objectives. And then I'll look at inflation. And then I'll touch a bit on balance of payments, but you don't need to worry too much about this one and this one. So let's get right into it. So economic growth is basically an increase in your GDP, right? It is an increase in the real GDP of a country. So we're not looking at GDP on its own. We're not looking at nominal GDP. We are looking at real GDP. Later on, I'm going to look at the difference between nominal and real GDP, and then you'll see why I'm making that distinction. So it is an increase in the real GDP of a country. So if your real GDP increased from 1,000 billion in 2020 to 2,000 billion in 2021, then that's economic growth because it is the real GDP increase, right? Also, another definition of economic growth is an expansion of the PPF. Remember that we did the production possibility curve or production possibility frontier in microeconomics last semester. So it is the expansion of your PPF. So when you're moving from PPF 1 to PPF 2, so the PPF has expanded, meaning I can produce more of both goods. I can produce more of good Y as well as more of good X. So it is the expansion of my PPF when my PPF has had a complete shift, right? So that's economic growth. You use real GDP to calculate economic growth. Whereas for the standards of living, you actually look at the real GDP per capita, meaning that you'll take real GDP. So real GDP is also called per head or per person. You will take the real GDP and you will divide by your population, because we are looking at real GDP per person, right? So that's how you calculate it. Okay, then let us look at how do we measure economic growth. Remember, we defined what economic growth is, and we said that it is an increase in real GDP, right? So let us look at how we actually calculate economic growth, right? So before we do that, we really need to understand what GDP is, because to get real GDP, now I need to remove the inflation effects. But let us look at the term GDP and look at what it means, right? So real GDP is a market value of all the final goods and services that are produced within the borders of a country in a given period of time. So let us zoom in to each part of the definition, right? I said, what is GDP? GDP is the market value of all the final goods and services that are produced within the borders of a country, Goods, for example, goods that are produced in South Africa, right? Not goods that are produced in the US. Goods that are produced within the borders of the country. And these are what? These are final goods and services. Final goods, meaning that they need to be consumed by the final consumer, right? They shouldn't produce other goods and services. They shouldn't be capital goods. Capital goods are goods that are used to produce other goods and services. And by market value, they mean that you are actually multiplying the quantity and the price, because it would not help to only look at the quantity increase. We want to know the market value of that quantity. So we'll multiply the quantity times its price, right? That's what they mean by market value. Okay, I'll look at it over again. So the market value, we are saying that you will multiply, you are looking at price times quantity of your final goods and services, right? Final goods and services. right? So let us look at what is included versus what is not included, because I'm definitely sure that this question is going to be there. So what is included? When you are asking yourself what is included, you go back to the definition. It says the market value of all the final goods and services, meaning that only final goods and services will be included, right? And it says produced within the borders of a country. So goods that are produced within South Africa. Goods produced within SA, right? So you look at goods produced in South Africa, goods produced by foreigners in South Africa. So your nationality does not matter when we are looking at GDP. It matters when we are looking at GNP, which is the gross national product. But don't worry about that for now. So it matters, Uguti, where are you, right? So it matters that you are in South Africa. It does not matter your nationality. So you can be a foreigner, but if you are producing in South Africa, we will count you as part of our GDP, right? Also, if you're national and you're in South Africa, so you will also be counted as part of our GDP, right? Now let us look at what is not included. So we don't include intermediate goods and services. So if we have the production of bread, right, and we first knead wheat and then flour and then make the bread, we're not going to count the intermediate goods, right, of making the bread. We are going to count the final good, right? But don't worry about the approaches of calculating GDP. I'm going to cover them, and then this will make sense, right? But we don't count intermediate goods and services, things like capital goods, etc., right? We don't count second-hand goods and services. So if someone is buying a vintage old car, vintage means old, but like if someone is selling an old car to their friend, that is a second-hand good. It's not going to be counted as part of your GDP. We're not going to count goods in the informal sector, because think about it, we don't know those people. They are in the informal sector. So those goods that are sold in the informal sector are not going to be counted as part of our GDP. If you're selling chickens to your neighbor, that's informal sector. We don't know about you and your neighbor. We don't know you own a business. So you won't be counted as part of the GDP. We won't count goods in the black markets. So goods like the selling of illegal drugs, etc., they are not going to be counted as part of our GDP, because we pretend as if that market does not exist, right? It's in the black markets. We don't count the selling and buying of shares, bonds, and securities. Reason being that it's not exactly the production of goods and services, but it is the movement of ownership from one person to the other, right? And then we look at what is not included, transfer payments. Transfer payments are things like your social grants, your food parcels, etc. Those things are not going to be counted as part of your GDP. Reason being is that your GDP has three approaches: the income approach, the consumption approach, as well as the production approach. So all these three should give you the same answer. So transfer payments are a consumption way, right? Because it's going to go to the final consumer and they're going to buy goods and services. However, there is no production that is linked to them getting those free transfer payments. There's no production that is linked to them getting social grants. So it's going to create an imbalance in my GDP when I'm using different methods, because they are going to be counted as part of consumption, but they won't be counted as part of the production, because those are freebies, right? Hence, we do not calculate them so as to make sure that my production approach gives me the same answer as my income approach, same answer as my consumption approach, right? Another thing that won't be added are goods produced by South African nationals in other countries, because the definition says they need to be produced within the borders of the country, right? So, yep. So right now I'm going to discuss the circular flow model. So I have an example of two circular flow models, the basic one, and then I go on to the one that's a bit complicated for a closed economy. And by saying closed economy, I mean that there's no foreign sector, right? So this is the basic one. Basic circular flow model. So we have different market participants. By market participants, we mean that those people are taking part in economic activities. They are buying goods and services. They are selling factors of production. There's a movement of cash from one person to the other. So they are basically participating in the economy, right? So The participants that we have are businesses and households in this basic one. In the one that I'm going to do just now, we also have government. And then in an open economy, you'll also have the foreign sector. But in this one, we are looking at a closed economy because there's no foreign sector. So there are no imports and exports, right? So I want you to make a distinction between two flows, right? The real flow and the monetary flow, right? So real flow, there's the real flow, and then there's the money flow. So these two markets are just markets. They are the middlemen between our households and businesses. So what will happen is that households, you know that households are the owners of the factors of production. They own land, they own capital, they own entrepreneurship, and they own capital. So households are going to provide the factors of production to businesses. But in order to get to businesses, they will sell them in the resource markets because that's the middleman. So households will bring the factors of production here, and this will be sold to businesses. So this flow, the one in dark pen, is what we call a real flow because there's no money involved as of yet. So there's a movement of factors of production from households all the way to businesses through the resource markets. And then businesses are going to use the same factors of production to produce goods and services, and then they are going to provide them in the product markets, right? And then after the goods and services have been made, they are going to be given to households, right? However, nothing is for free in this world, so you need to pay for what you get. So remember that households gave businesses factors of production, so businesses have to pay for the factors of production. So this dotted line shows me my monetary flow, right? And households, remember that businesses use the factors of production to produce goods and services. So households also have to pay for the goods and services. So households are going to pay for the goods and services. So the dotted line is what is our monetary flow. This dark one is our real flow because it's the flow of the factors of production and the flow of goods and services. Whereas this one is the flow of the payment for the goods and services as well as the factors of production, right? So that's the basic one. And then we have this one where now we involve the markets. Everything else remains the same, right? However, now we have the market, the government. Did I say markets? We have the government involved now. So what does the government do? The government taxes households and firms, and the government provides public goods and services. However, it also buys goods and services from businesses. So let's look at those flows. So from the resource market, what are they going to buy? They are going to buy the factors of production because remember, as much as we have public goods, they are still goods. They are still going to need the factors of production so that they can be made. So government is going to buy the factors of production from the resource markets, and they are going to pay for them. So real flow, monetary flow. Government are going to also buy the factors. They are also going to buy goods and services from the product market, and they are going to pay for them, right? And then the government is going to give public goods and services to businesses, and then it's going to receive taxes from businesses. The government is also going to provide public goods and services to households, and they are going to receive taxes and in return. So those are your two circular flow models. If you have an open economy, obviously you will have the foreign sector, and then we will look at exports and imports. So that is just that, right? So we have discussed the circular flow. We are almost there. So now I want us to discuss the three methods of calculating GDP. I said we have the production approach, we have the income approach, we have the expenditure approach. So let us look at the first one. So the production approach looks at the value added production. So let us take an example where you are making bread. Let's say you need wheat and flour to make bread. So let us say the farmer incurs a cost of 50 Rand. This is where the production starts. There's no anything else, right? So the wheat costs the farmer 50 Rand. And then that wheat is used to make flour, meaning that the person making the flour, they are going to take the 50 Rand they incurred from the wheat, and they are going to add 30 Rand for the value added that they had in this production process. So to make bread, it means that I had the initial 50 Rand plus, remember in the flour, in this 80 Rand, I have the 50 Rand from the wheat plus the value added. So I do not take 80 Rand. I don't add 80 Rand, but I add 30 Rand. So I'm going to add 30 Rand, and then I'm going to have 80 Rand. It would be wrong to say 50 plus 80 because that is what double counting. So the reason why on the production approach I have value added is to avoid double counting. So to avoid double counting, because I would be double counting the 50 rand if I said 50 rand plus 80 rand, because in this 80 rand there is this 50 rand. So that's the production approach for you. And then we look at the income approach. So with the income approach, we are moving from a net perspective to a gross perspective. So I'm going to have net factor cost. Anything that has to do with the factors of production will be in this net factor cost. So you have things like compensation of employees, less interest, plus proprietors income, less dividends. What am I forgetting? Yeah, it's that approach. Is to get to the net factor cost. And then you are going to add, so when you are done adding those things and subtracting what you should, you are going to get to the net factor cost. So to move from this to the market price, I need to add indirect taxes and I need to subtract subsidies. Subsidies are those payments that governments make to businesses in order to lessen the cost of production. This is to make sure that it's to lessen poverty in a way. So if you think about bread that is sold in shops like ShopRite, right? I don't know how much it is, but probably it's going to be 10 rand, 7 rand, somewhere there. So that bread has been subsidized because the government paid for part of the production. So you're going to have production subsidies and consumption subsidies, but don't worry about that. That's not something we cover, but it's just to like lessen, right, the impact of poverty on I'm looking for a term, the disadvantaged consumers, right? So we will add indirect taxes and subtract subsidies from the net factor cost, and then we get the net market price, and then we add depreciation to get to GDP. And the reason why we are adding depreciation and not subtracting it is because, remember, to get to net GDP, to get to net domestic products, I will take GDP less depreciation. So meaning that to move from net to GDP, it's an equation, so I solve it. So it's going to be net domestic product plus depreciation. So yeah. And then the last approach, which is the expenditure approach. So here we're looking at GDP is equal to consumption plus gross investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So I need to emphasize that this is gross investment. So if you are calculating GDP and they give you net investment, you need to add the depreciation, right? Because you are calculating gross. But if you're calculating a net domestic product and they give you a net investment, then you just add it as it is, right? Last thing is real GDP versus nominal GDP. So real GDP is GDP that has no inflation. They will use terms like it has been adjusted for inflation, right? And then with nominal GDP, it is GDP with inflation. So it's GDP that has inflation in it. The real GDP change will show you output changes. This is very important. Whenever you have a real GDP and there's a change from one year to another, it's showing you a change in the output. However, if you have a nominal GDP change from one year to another, it's going to show you both the output change as well as the inflation change, right? So in order to distinguish between the two, the output change and the inflation change, you have to calculate the inflation rates using a CPI, which we will cover in another video, right? So then real GDP is GDP at base year prices or at constant prices. A base year is a reference year, and this you will always be given the base year, right? GDP, nominal GDP is GDP at current prices, right? It's market prices. The price, if you go to a shop and you find the sneaker to be 1.5, that's the nominal GDP because it's at current prices, what the GDP is right now. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you guys learned a lot. Please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Most importantly, please don't forget to subscribe. Road to 1K subscribers. Please make sure you like, make sure you comment, even if it's just a thank you on the comment section. Please comment. In the next video, I'm going to be doing chapter 24. Let me see what it looks at. Chapter 24 looks at economic growth on a broader scope, right? So it will look at growth theories. It will look at, let me see. It will look at the production function where we're looking at the labor markets. Very important concept, that one. And then, yeah. So thank you so much for watching. See you guys in the next video. Bye.